Let's talk about requesting and taking ownership of Photon View objects. What this means basically is changing the owner of the object. Think of a game perhaps where you're trying to capture a flag, and maybe it's a team game, and in order to move the flag around with your character, you have to own the flag. So if for any reason your character drops the flag, someone else needs to be able to pick it up and take ownership. That's when you might use something like this. To begin, I'm going to go to my resources folder and then drop the cube prefab into the scene. This just has an animator, a photon view, the animator view, and basically a couple things to get it moving, but otherwise there's nothing really fancy about it. One thing to note is my simple object mover script, which is attached to this cube, will only work for the owner of the object. So I'm going to make a quick build and show you that. But first, if you're coming from my previous videos, I have quick instantiate in my scene, which will spawn a cube. I'm going to actually disable that and only use the cube that's already in the scene. And now I'm going to go ahead and make a build. I have the build up. I created the room on the executable in this window here. So that means that this executable has ownership. So when I move it around, you can see that it's working fine. Now whenever I go over to my game view and I try to move the cube around in my editor, which I'm trying to do right now, you can see that it's not working. That indicates that the ownership check is working on my movement script. Now I'm going to make a new script. I'm going to go to my scripts folder and then single use. And I'm going to make a new script. I will call it ownership transfer. And I'm going to open that script up. First, I'm going to get rid of the start and update methods, and I'm going to add a private void on mouse down. So I want to process the ownership request whenever someone clicks on my cube. In order to do that, I have to access the photon view on the object. So I'm going to change mono behavior to mono behavior pun and add the namespace as well. And then on mouse down, I'll do base.photonview.request ownership. Then I'm going to head back to Unity. I don't want to mess up my prefab, so I'm going to right click my cube and then choose unpack prefab completely. Depending on your Unity version, it might say break prefab. Next, I'm going to change the owner from fixed on the photon view for my cube to takeover. And I'm going to go down to the bottom and I'm going to add the new ownership transfer script. The difference between takeover and request is that whenever you request ownership and it's set to takeover, it will grant you ownership without any condition checking. With request, a player has to authorize the transfer of ownership. Generally, the player authorized the transfer is the one that owns the object, but it could be anyone. I have a build up with the changes I just made. The executable is the current owner. So if I go over to the Unity client and I try to move, which I'm doing right now, it's not going to work. But if I click the cube, you can see the request ownership down in the bottom, also in my console. And now I should be able to move the cube around on the Unity client. Now let's show you how to do the request option instead of the takeover. To start, let's head back to the script. And let's add the interface pun ownership callbacks. And then I'm going to implement the interface. And you see on ownership request and then on ownership transferred. This method will call on any object which utilizes the ipun ownership callbacks. So it's important that you make sure the target view matches up with the view on this object before you process any of the code. So I'm going to do if target view doesn't equal base.photonView return, and I'm going to copy these two lines and throw this on the on ownership transferred as well. You don't necessarily have to have anything in the on ownership transferred either. This is just an optional step. However, for the on ownership request, I'm going to go down a few lines and I'm going to type in base.photonView.transfer ownership, and I'm going to send ownership over to the requesting player. If you had any checks you wanted to perform, you'd execute this just like any other code. So add checks here, and if something didn't match up, you could just exit the method and not transfer the ownership. Now I have to set up the callbacks so that these methods are called properly. I'm going to do it on awake. So I'll do Photon network dot add callback target this, indicating to call back this script. And this is going to register the IPUN ownership callbacks internally. And then I'm going to do private void on destroy Photon network dot remove callback target this. And just like we discussed with events, if you don't want the callbacks to execute when the object's disabled, you would run this code on enable and then run this code on disable instead of using awake and destroy. So with everything saved, I'm going to go back to Unity. I'm going to go to my game scene and make sure the cube is set to request. And then I'm going to do another build and test it out. Right now the executable has ownership and it seems to be working. So if I go over to the Unity client, can't move. If I click the cube, I see the transfer ownership indicating that I received it. And now I can move the cube around. So just to be thorough, I'm going to remove the comment or the line where I am transferring ownership and try it again just to make sure it doesn't work. So I commented out that line based off Photon view.transfer ownership. Now I'm going to go back to Unity and make another quick build and test it. I have the new build up with the line commented out. Executable has ownership as expected. Going over to the Unity client, I'm clicking the cube. I'm seeing it's requesting ownership, but there's no transfer confirmation. And if I try to move, I cannot. So that indicates that everything is working as expected.